All right, welcome everybody. At least in my neck of the woods, it's a bit rainy, but I hope that we'll have some sunny days soon. My name is Dr. Joanna Wozniak-Brown, and I'm the Assistant Director of Resilience Planning at the Connecticut Institute for Resilience and Climate Adaptation. I'm pleased to welcome you to the second in a series of webinars about climate change and public health. We're covering a range of critical topics at the intersection of climate change and public health. Today, we're exploring heat. Our presenter today is Dr. Mariana Fragomeni, an assistant professor in the Department of Plant Science and Landscape Architecture. If you have any questions throughout the webinar, please post them in the chat box. Either chat or Q&A, either will work, and we'll answer them at the end of the webinar. As a reminder, you'll be able to access a recording of this webinar on our YouTube page following the event. If you click subscribe on our YouTube channel, just a little plug, if you click subscribe, you'll get a notification every time a new video is posted, so we welcome you to do that. So now I'll turn the presentation. Oh, I also wanted to let you know too about the other events that we have coming up too. So right now we're on heat. On Tuesday we had the climate change and public health overview, but we have equity, vector-borne disease, recreational water, and emergency preparedness coming up. So now I'll welcome Mariana to present.
Hello, everyone. Unfortunately, my connection is also kind of wonky, so I'm going to have to stop my video so I can share my screen and ensure that you're all seeing everything. But thanks for coming in. It's a pleasure talking to you. So hopefully you can see my screen and my presentation. Oops. My apologies. My screen has been my mouse has been a little sensitive today. Okay, so we're going to be talking today about heat, public health, and climate change. And I know it's a mouthful, but I promise you it's all going to come together. So why heat? Well, for those of you who don't know, the reason why heat is at the forefront of a lot of the discussions that we're having. Heat is responsible for the highest number of weather-related fatalities in the U.S. in the last 30 years. In fact, it has been topping the list in the last 10 years as well. And it actually does kill more than hurricanes, tornadoes, and floods, as you can see in this chart right here. And the health implications to heat exposure can vary vastly. It can start from anything from heat stress and just your body's ability to cool down properly, but it can go all the way to some really major serious heat illnesses like heat stroke. And it really does have a serious effect in our livelihoods, and not many people understand the dangers. And it's also known as the silent killer, because a lot of times you don't actually notice that you're becoming sick from being exposed to heat. And heat does not affect people in the same way. It doesn't affect the same. So the more vulnerable people are the infants and children up to 4 years of age, elderly citizens over 65, people with pre-existing conditions, and those two populations certainly overlap a lot. Pregnant women, people not acclimatized, or better yet, accustomed to heat, and that's a serious case here in our state. Low-income populations and the homeless, who have a very hard time accessing infrastructure that allows them to cool down. And what does that mean then to us in the state of Connecticut? Well, recent studies have shown that there's a higher sensitivity for residents in the Northeast to heat than compared to other warmer regions in the country. When you look at the heat index and when people start to actually be burdened health-wise, we're talking about anything from 85 to 95 degrees, depending on how humid the air is. Meaning we can't sweat, we can't cope with the climate, with the weather, and so we start getting sick. But our heat alerts actually occur above 95, meaning for about 10 degrees Fahrenheit, people can start getting sick, and we're actually not emitting any warning signs. And higher sensitivity factors include things like I mentioned before, lower acclimatization. We're not used to these extreme temperatures. less awareness to the heat risks, the fact that you should be coming in and cooling down for a bit, drinking more water. All those things are implications to how you are at risk. And fewer structural adaptations, such as air conditioning, which is not as common in the state as other states that are used to warmer temperatures as well. Sorry about that. Okay. So what has it been like in the past for Connecticut? Well, the observations show that since 1895, on average, we've seen a 0.3 degree Fahrenheit increase per decade in temperatures. And we're seeing since the 1980s that the extremes are increasing. We're seeing a higher number of colder days, and we're also seeing a higher number of warmer days. There's an increase in numbers of summer days where the maximum temperatures are above 77 Fahrenheit. And there's a decrease in the number of frost days. We're seeing where we have temperatures below 32 Fahrenheit. And the projections aren't getting any better. We're seeing large temperature increases on average for mid and late century, between 5 to 8 degree Fahrenheit increases. And the greater increases are seen in the summer months by mid-century, June through August, about approximately 6 Fahrenheit increase. And then by the late century, fall months, September, November, up to 10 Fahrenheit increases. What is also important to notice are the number of tropical nights. And usually when we have temperatures above 68 degrees, and the reason why we're worried about nighttime is the time when you get a chance to cool down from a hot day. But when these days increase, our adaptive capacity is reduced. So in the present day, we see 10 days of tropical nights, but the projections show that by mid-century, we're going to see about 40 days. And by late century, we're talking 70 days a year. And we're also projected to see a higher number of warm spell days. We currently see on average 4 per year, but we're seeing something around 48 to 100 by the late century. And then a significant reduction in the number of frost days, meaning days below 32 Fahrenheit by late century. We're talking a reduction by 64 days from the current statistics to the next 20 years, by 2040. But some of our vulnerable groups are projected to grow. We have a projection of growth of over 5% for children and infants under the age of 4, and a projection of increase of over 9% for elderly citizens. And that's significant because we're going to have to deal with more children, but more significantly, more elderly citizens who are all equally vulnerable to heat and an increase on top of an increasing heat. So our vulnerability is trending to increase over the next century. The EPA also points out that projections indicate that the region as a whole, the northeastern region as a whole, will face an increase that runs between 960 premature deaths in a moderate CO2 scenario to up to 2,300 premature deaths in a high CO2 projection, meaning temperatures will rise and more people are likely to die in the region if we don't take measures. And so we are talking about the heat vulnerability and how do we address heat vulnerability given the scenarios. And in most times when we're talking about heat vulnerability, what we're actually discussing is the physiology, meaning our body's ability to respond to heat. And it's also linked to our behaviors. As I said, do we actually understand that this is an issue, and what kind of precautions do we take on a hot day? But what has been less studied or less evaluated is actually the environmental conditions and how we can adapt to the environment to better cope with the situation when it comes to heat. And studies have indicated that urban environments are linked to higher risk because of the occurrence of heat islands. And we also know that our current population already has limited adaptive capacity. So what can we do? What multiple measures can we take to better adapt and address heat head on? So my team and I have been working on the Resilient Connecticut project focused on heat. And really what we're trying to answer is how can we better adapt the local environment to support adaptation to heat? How do we give information? How do we support local decision making? And what are the environmental factors that are driving our vulnerability to heat in combination with what we already know, the physiological and social vulnerabilities that exist? So our main objective for this project is to identify the areas that are vulnerable to heat. We are looking at cold extremes as well, because as I pointed out, the extremes are growing, but we have a higher emphasis on heat due to the indications of a higher health risk. And we're trying to analyze land surface data, meaning we're looking for satellite images to look at how these surfaces are reacting and heating up and where these heat islands are occurring. But more importantly, have they been intensifying over the years? Are we seeing a trend in growth? And is that actually linked to the way we use our land? So we want to understand the linkages between the land surface temperature changes and the types of land cover that exist and how they have changed over time, so that we can better interpret the variation and its linkages to urbanization. If we know that urban environments tend to be locations where people are more exposed and are going to be more vulnerable, then have we actually grown? Are we sprawling? And how are our environments behaving, so that we can then better address and adapt to those issues? Our boundary for now is New Haven and Fairfield County areas, but we do have potential for expansion to the entire state, and we're hoping to do that. And this project is a 12-month project with 3 phases. Phase 1 has a short-term analysis of land surface temperature, focused on a 5-year time frame to understand sort of the current conditions for the study and also allow us to create a basis for this. At the same time, we're working with Circuit to incorporate and establish the methodology for framing heat vulnerability. So combining the existing index that they've been working on and the vulnerability mapping to quantify and interpret these thermal impacts from both a demographic standpoint, but also from an environmental standpoint. How do these two link together, and are there ways and locations that are going to be more vulnerable to others given the combination of these factors? And our second phase, we have a long-term analysis, and we're going to look at over 20 years of data to understand how land use and land cover has changed over time and how that has effectively impacted our response to heat, or the occurrence or intensification of urban heat islands, so that we can then figure out what are options. How do we enhance our use of landscapes? How do we help decision makers to plan for these things and adapt? So can we intensify parks? Can we incorporate greenways? What are things that we can do at the local level that would effectively help us adapt to rising temperatures? Our final phase is focused on the heat vulnerability and interpreting how potential escalations on these urban heat islands might actually impact human health and well-being. So if we do nothing, what would happen, and how much are we increasing our vulnerability by? So this is a little bit of what we've been doing currently and where we're at in the project. We're currently in phase 1. We've just started this summer. my team and I, Tracy Miller and going to set up our methodology and our baseline, and then we'll expand to the entire 2 counties where we're doing our studies. And we should be done with this phase by the end of the month. And so this is an example of how we started to identify the different types. And we're really not just focused on the use of these areas, but really on the morphology, meaning the form. So what types of landscapes are we talking about? Is this a built environment? Are these dense trees or low plants? What are featured in these areas? What are materials that are composing them? How do they function? And what are examples within the cities that we're looking at that kind of really show how these places look like and how they behave? So we associate these with photographs so that they help us go into the second part of what we've been doing, which is actually classifying and mapping these. We do use computer simulations to do this. So it's we've run 4 iterations so far for the classifications, trying to run different models and reclassifying, reevaluating the areas that we're using in our machine learning process to try and interpret what classifications have been working better. These are only 2 examples of around 20 maps that we've already made just for the city of New Haven and its adjacent towns. And what we do see from what we've analyzed so far is an intensification and a densification. So things like this, for example, are some shopping malls, what we classified as open low-rise. And what we do see over time is sort of the expansion and densification of these areas, and you start to see that happening. The orange, for instance, are residential areas, and you can see it went from a light orange to a darker orange, meaning we're seeing sort of a densification again occurring as kind of a general interpretation of what the classifications are indicating to us. On top of that, we've also worked with Circa to start a heat sensor deployment process where, based on the classifications that we've made, we've deployed 20 heat sensors, and these are the locations where they are where they're stationed at currently. And we started in August, and they'll stay there for until the end of October. To try and ground truth some of the data that we're going to be capturing from the satellites now as we move forward and finish off the phase 1 of the project, and also to compare with what we're seeing over time. So these are heat and humidity sensor loggers, and they're stationed in these locations to kind of show us whether there is actually microclimatic variations between these types of land covers, and kind of understand whether or not and where urban heat islands are occurring within the city. And we're hoping also these help us interpret and understand potential vulnerabilities. So we do have some of these locations purposely cited in vulnerable communities. The next steps for the project, as we finish off phase 1, we're going to do the land surface temperature changes, and that's scheduled to end by the end of the month, as I said. Then we're going to move on to phase 2, where we're going to analyze over 20 years of data and the relationships between the changes in land cover and the temperatures. Just to give you an example of the footprint of the image that we're using, one flyover of a Landsat satellite image takes up pretty much almost the entire state. And even though we're only focused on this section of the state for now, we have plenty of data to support us moving ahead and doing the rest of the state as well. And just out of curiosity, we will be analyzing approximately 381 images for the total 20 years plus analysis. We are choosing 2 satellites to use. Landsat 5 is a very reliable satellite for kind of the older images. It's been running since the 1980s. We're really focused in the 1990s, so we can compare it to some of the national land cover data set that's been made available also with these satellites. So we won't dive into the 80s, but we'll stick to the 90s for sure. That satellite stopped working in 2012. And so in order to move further and do further comparisons, we're actually adding another satellite coming from the flyovers in Landsat 8. And that's where a lot of the data is coming from for the temperature evaluations. And this data is what we're going to use to compare to the sensors that we have on the ground currently. And we hope maybe by next summer, we'll be able to run the sensors again and do a second round of analysis too. And with that, I'll leave you with some final thoughts as my time is almost over. This project intends to demonstrate an increase in surface temperature during this study period, but it really is linking it to, in my mind, the loss of specific and important forested and vegetated land covers. Research in this area shows that the loss of vegetation in urban areas and the lack of interconnectedness between vegetated land covers has been critical for us for the occurrence of urban heat islands. And so as a landscape architect and as a researcher, I believe this research has a lot of contributions in the sense of showing how vegetated open space in cities really needs to be at the forefront of decision making for things like we're talking about at the intersection of heat, public health, and climate change. We hope that the data created will support local decision making and promote adaptation. I'm a firm believer that heat response planning needs to go beyond communication. I've been working with Laura Bosey and Laura Hayes and Mark Mitchell, who's presenting next week on extreme heat events for the GC3 Council. And we've been proponents of going beyond communication and really incorporating more on the planning of cities, on thinking through awareness, preparedness, and really revisiting vulnerability, reanalyzing. This is a moving target. Heat is going to change throughout time, and we are going to have to revise these things constantly. And the more people we have on board, the better it's going to be. And we need to understand the environmental drivers that exacerbate heat so we can support adaptive measures at the city scale. We really do need to support our local communities and enable more than just our public health departments, but also our planning departments, our city officials to understand the role that they play in climate change. So with that said, I will end my talk here, and I'm sorry for all the back and forth that I was doing in the beginning with my slides, and I appreciate your time. Thank you.
That was great. Thank you very much. I'm just going to switch screens here.
Yeah, let me just turn it off.
There we go.
Okay, cool.
So we had a couple questions coming in. Thank you very much for that presentation. It was fantastic to hear about the research and everything that you and the team are doing. So I encourage everybody to add some questions to the chat or the Q&A. So I'll start with the first question that came in, and it says, is there a race component to heat sensitivity?
I think Mark will be able to talk more about that, but yes, there is. There's definitely a race component to heat sensitivity. There's definitely a component there on language barriers that we're seeing in New Haven as well. So yes, I think the short answer is yes, there's definitely a race component to this.
Yes, definitely. And as you said, Dr. Mitchell will be talking about the issues of equity and some of the social disparities that have led to particular sensitivities to heat and these impacts too across different groups. So the next question was, how did you determine the time frame for analysis to start for 2015 to 2019? Can you see trends with only a 4 to 5 year time scale?
So the time frame, the current time frame was kind of just seeing whether it's much more on the land cover types, and particularly on form, and kind of identifying and testing the classification. And those are the trends that we're starting to see. We haven't been able to see intensification on the heat side. That I think is going to happen much more in the long-term analysis. I think we certainly can see a little bit of an expansion on it, but there's definitely trends in growth or in densification, and I think those are very important things to point out even at the short term.
Thank you. So then the next one is, what are the indicators that are used in the computer simulations to fine-tune the actual landscape typologies?
So the indicators are us. We've been verifying. We kind of go back and forth, and we haven't been able to do site visits. So we've been using Google Earth, and we've been kind of back and forth, go in, look, take pictures, redefine the boundaries, and have the machine, because it's machine learning based classification, we have it run it again and see if it starts to fine tune. A lot of it is fine tuning kind of the edges or areas where you have scattered trees with houses underneath, and it's actually identifying those as mainly dense forest areas, but in fact there's urbanization going in. So we also look at it seasonally and look at different seasons. So winter months where you have less vegetation compared to summer months where we've got dense vegetation cover, and make sure that the machine can interpret those and better define the areas that are categorized.
Sounds like an iterative process.
Yes, it's been 2 months. Kat and Tracy have been very patient.
Team effort.
Yes, for sure.
So our next question is, or a comment was that Dave Murphy from Wozniak-Brown is a consultant working with Resilient Connecticut. He noted that if anybody's looking for an example of how urban heat island data was used to decide where to reduce impervious surfaces over the long term, he has an example from Holyoke, Massachusetts. So we'll get that resource from Dave and share that on our website. So we had somebody ask, what is the potential causes of temperature change and how to deal with them?
Sorry, I lost you a bit, Joanna. I can hear you.
What's the potential causes of temperature change and how to deal with them?
Wow, this is a complex question. What are the potential causes for temperature change? Well, surfaces, for instance. The artificial surfaces like concrete and just the way they behave, both reflecting and absorbing heat, are completely change the energy balance inside cities. So what you're seeing is just changes in variations in the way temperature gets reflected, or heat gets reflected or absorbed, and how then at night it gets released into the air. And so at night it tends to be cooler, but it's really not, because you've got all these surfaces kind of emitting heat out into the city. So that's an example, a very clear example of how we see these changes and how it relates to the work we're doing, is the changes in these surfaces are responsible in great part for the heating that's occurring. And as the more dense we get, the closer together we get, the hotter it gets too. And the higher our buildings are, so the creations of sort of these canyons, we don't have as much wind flowing in our cities. And so there's less dispersion of heat. We don't have the cooling shade of trees. Grasses do okay, but they don't do the same thing for our cities. And so all that plays a huge role. So the way we mold our cities, the way we change them, the surfaces that we choose to fill them impact and help exacerbate and increase temperatures.
Thank you. Our next question is, how do you decide what vulnerability consists of, and can you include pregnancy and areas with already high rates of preterm birth, which we know is linked in epidemiology to exposure to heat? And they say thank you.
Vulnerability, it changes a lot, but vulnerability is anybody who is more susceptible and has less of adaptive capacity to deal with with heat or any other stressor. And I do mention pregnancy in my slides. Pregnant women are vulnerable. But from the policy standpoint, I really don't have any experience with particular populations that kind of deal with vulnerability as a whole. But it's kind of a moving target. So I don't know how to deal with it specifically. And that's a great question, I think, to be thought of. Having been a pregnant woman during the summer myself in Georgia, it was horrible. It's an issue, and it's a population that really does get affected. And there's plenty of studies to prove the impacts to preterm birth or birth outcomes. So there's definitely implications, and I think there's room for more discussions and thinking through how to include pregnant women more clearly in policies.
Yes, definitely. It's just another addition to the climate change is a wicked problem for sure with all the layers.
And also it's I think I just to point out, Joanna, sorry to interrupt. It's also it's very hard to quantify heat in general, the impacts of heat. It's not always obvious that somebody that somebody got sick or ended up passing away from heat. It's not as obvious sometimes. So it's really, the data is very hard to attain, and it's hard to track from an epidemiology standpoint. And I think Laura Hayes would be better equipped to talk about it than me. But it's important to point out that there is also an issue of quantifying it, right? And unfortunately, from a policy standpoint, we really do need to quantify. We do need to have something visual. We need data.
It's interesting that you said that, because that actually tees up the next question. So that was perfect. So the next question is, what kinds of information do the sensors collect, and how would the measurements from the sensors work with spatial data from satellite imagery?
So the sensors are capturing heat and humidity. The comparison with the satellite is coming from the heat, because the data that the satellites have is actually temperature data coming from the surfaces. So we can compare that. But it also, because it's capturing heat and humidity, it allows us to interpret what's the sensation of heat. So we can develop something called a heat index and actually ascertain what's the sensation, the combined sensation between high humidity, let's say, for instance, and high temperatures. And so is this a comfortable situation, or is this an additional stress on people? And so it allows us to think through a little bit more, and specifically how that land cover type collaborates to the increase of temperatures of heat sensation or not, whether it mitigates in some way. So it's speaking more to the microclimate. It's both a comparative measure, but also kind of diving deeper into our findings and kind of opening up, unpacking that a little bit more too.
Great, thank you. And it kind of the impetus for doing some of the sensors was for that human experience and how people actually feel on the ground instead of the temperatures. Yes, that's great. So the next question, there's a lot of great questions today. Are there any examples of model communities that have implemented some of the recommendations that your research suggests?
No, not that I know of.
Not yet.
But maybe somebody, do you know any examples, Joanna?
I think not yet is probably the best way to say it. I think for some folks that they might not be aware of the Resilient Connecticut project, which you can check out at resilientconnecticut.uconn.edu, which is this research is a part of a large-scale climate planning project in Fairfield and New Haven counties. And so that we're hoping to parlay this active planning opportunities and the research into real projects, resiliency projects, and putting all these pieces together so that they can be models for the Northeast and everywhere, in fact.
And I'll add to that by saying also that I do know that there are towns that are interested and that are striving to do it. It's just the desire is there. There's just no funding, or there's a lot of communities that are seeking out funding to try and engage with this more. And it's been amazing to join UConn since January and just be involved in so many things over the summer. And so there's definitely some desire to do it. And I agree with Joanna, not yet is there the right answer. I think we're moving there, and we're moving there fast.
And it might be happening in smaller examples like pocket parks or changing regulations to allow green roofs. So probably not any model communities just yet, but maybe some model projects.
Yes.
So the next question is, other than voting, are there changes that individuals can make to reduce heat islands?
Other than voting. Yeah, I mean, I think we need to be stewards of the land. I say that to my students all the time, and I think that's true to anyone. I think we can be advocates for more green space. COVID has even heightened this even more, the need that we have to be outdoors, to have a space where we have fresh air, and we should all be entitled to it, whether it's a pocket park in your neighborhood or trees in open space and trails and greenways, or community gardens. I think that's where it all starts. It's just I think we need to be clear on the role that these spaces play in our health, in our well-being. And part of it's educational, but if we're there already, we need to become advocates for it. We need to become stewards of our land. We need to appreciate the ecology that surrounds us.
I think that that's a fantastic message to round out our webinar with. So that was fantastic. Thank you very much, Mariana. I do want to point out to folks to let them know about the remaining topics that we have coming up in the mini webinar series, and you can register in the right-hand corner. There's a little short link that you can use to get to register for the rest of the series. And be sure to check out resilientconnecticut.uconn.edu and circa.uconn.edu to learn more about the project. And you can email us with any questions too at circa@uconn.edu as things come up. And we look forward to hearing from you, and we are glad to be of service. So thank you very much, and everybody have a wonderful day.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.